Robert, thanks for doing this. Great to meet you.
It's good to meet you too, Michael.
So, sometimes I like to do backstories of get into how you got to this point, working with Mike, doing the work that you're doing. I think it's appropriate for people that are not familiar with your work to know who you are, and if you don't mind sharing how you got to this point.
Yeah, so I enlisted in the U.S. Army Reserve as an intel analyst with the idea that I was going to go to college simultaneously. That didn't happen, but I did get to deploy to Iraq in 2011, where I worked at basically the joint shop level, the J2 in Al Anbar province at Al Asad Air Base. So I got some time there. I then worked at Army Central Command in Kuwait on a task force covering regional topics. Then I got out, went to college for a few years. I ended up going to the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M to get my master's, and then I started the job search. I in 2019, so December 2019, I graduated. I then had a time where I was just working odd jobs, and then I saw a post on Twitter where Mike said he was looking for a domestic analyst.
And for not to
And
interrupt you, Robert, for people that don't, Mike Shelby, who I just had on last
yeah,
week. So,
yeah, Mike Shelby. I saw a post where he's looking for a domestic analyst. So I actually just went to the website and I sent an email with my resume, and they got back to me, and we basically got hit the ground running. I think almost immediately that very next Monday. So this was on a Friday or Saturday. The very next Monday, Mike had me working for him almost immediately. And the first thing I actually worked on was a just doing some research on water security issues in the United States.
so this is perfect timing with the water security, but I want to go backwards a second here to your time in Kuwait. What were you doing there?
Also, I was an all source intelligence analyst. So basically, what I do is I look at all these different sources. So you have human intelligence or human signals intelligence, SIGINT, imagery. They call it GeoInt now. It used to be called IMINT. And other different specialized fields of intelligence, and I effectively fuse all of that information together to provide predictive analysis. So something that the customer, whether it's like our commander or another agency or someone else, a law policymaker or decision maker, they can use that to actually make a strategic decision.
So okay, so explain this to me like I'm 5 years old. A scenario. Can you provide a scenario that you were doing there that you did a report on and provided to the powers that be that they were able to make their decision? This episode is brought to you by Vaulted. Launched by McIlvaney Financial Group, with Vaulted, I literally just tap a button and bam, I own physical gold stored in a professional vault. I can also take delivery at any time, extremely simple and less expensive than any other method. The do it yourself way to buy precious metals. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to vaulted.blbvux.net /coffee and a mic. I mean, look at how easy this is. The Vaulted app on my phone, I can access it at any time.
Well, I don't want to get too much into stuff that is likely still classified, but I mean, in general, just a general scenario that I would do is let's say the commander in the battle space. So in Iraq, there might be a unit that wants to know about who's putting IEDs around. So then I'll get on the computer connected to classified networks, and I'll look up any kind of human intelligence reports, or signals that have been collected on IED makers and IED cells that are placing IEDs. I'll try to collate all that information, dig through, look at like historical trends of where these people might be operating, and I write a report that says it has my insights into who these people might be, what the patterns of where they operate at, what kind of IEDs they're making, and then that gets disseminated upward to whoever is at the head of that intelligence shop in the army. It's usually S2 for battalion level, and G2, J2. It just depends on the level of the where the shop is at, whether it's battalion, brigade, or like in Iraq, it was an entire joint theater shop. So we had Army, Air Force, and Navy. At Kuwait, it was a G2, so it was a brigade level command. And then we would basically send that finished intelligence product. So that with that, whenever somebody collects something like human, SIGINT, or imagery, that's information. That would be information, and then it's turned into an intelligence by fusing that with all the other disciplines to try to get something useful out of it. Whether whatever type of information is useful, and it put it together and create a finished intelligence product that includes analysis based on my own research and background.
And then would you make your suggestions on what should or should not happen based upon the report? Is it safe to, I mean, is it fair for me to say it's a report at the end of the day? Like,
Yes, yeah,
with
yeah,
images
basic.
and
Yeah, and it can take multiple forms. So you can have imagery. We slide books
I'm a
are big,
civilian
so
here,
it's
Robert. So you explain this to me again, like I'm 5 years old with some of this
yeah.
stuff.
So it can take different forms. So one of the things we do for the show is actually pretty close to what we would do in that scenario. Is we have like slide books where we put together maps to try to give a visual representation of what we're talking about, or timelines of events. It might be something called a white paper, which is usually a 1 to 2 page, or it could be longer, but typically it's you want the shorter it is, the better. The more information dense, the better, because the people that are making these decisions, whether it's policymakers, have battlefield commanders, they don't have 45 minutes to sit down and read something. They don't have hours to read something. They need to get the most important information up front. So it could take those kind of forms. As far as recommendations, typically no, because that's up to the commander themselves or whoever the customer is to make that decision. And in order to have in order to eliminate bias or try to eliminate as much bias as possible, you don't typically I wouldn't make like put a recommendation into an intelligence product.
You did that for how long?
In the army, my enlistment was 6 years. I did a year deployment. Half of that was Iraq, and half was at the task force in Kuwait.
Doing these types of assessments and these type
Yeah.
of intelligence.
Yep.
What was your experience like when that wrapped up of what you've seen? I mean, I can't even imagine what you've seen in that time.
Well, it was interesting because I was there during the official withdrawal, basically. So that's why I had half time at the J2 in Iraq and half the time in the task force in Kuwait, because we withdrew over Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq at the time. He didn't want to renew the status of forces agreement with the Obama administration, basically saying that they could not prosecute American personnel. So we pulled back. Some people remained in the green zone in the embassy, and then most of us went out to Kuwait to establish this task force. It was called Task Force Spartan Shield, and we basically sat there and waited to go to possibly go back in with some other units that were there at the time that also withdrew to Kuwait. It was interesting. I love doing the work. I'm sure a lot of people actually being put in that position will probably find it boring, but I like doing it. I like reading through, doing analysis, and trying to figure out, basically solving puzzles effectively.
And how much has technology evolved? So if you had to do that job today, and correct me here, I'm assuming it would be much easier today than would have been when you were doing it.
Well, yeah, the technological side of it, just the proliferation of drones. So you have a lot more like full motion video, a lot more ISR capabilities at a much lower level. So instead of having to wait on these big theater level or strategic level intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, you have, in like we saw in Ukraine, there's all these FPV drones. There's a lot of drones being used for recon now. A lot of that capability has been pushed down to the tactical levels. There's just a lot more information to work with, especially when you're talking like imagery and video.
You're definitely proving that life is not a straight line, Robert. On your like career trajectory.
Yeah, and that so speaking of that, in the interim period between the time I finished at the Bush School and working for Mike, I had a couple of jobs. One, I was a longshoreman for a short time. I built cabinets for a while for this company here called Sea Ray. They make the people probably know them because they make like party boats, effectively like small yachts. And I worked in the wood shop as a cabinet assistant, and I also delivered pizza for a little while. I worked for Google as a contractor for about a year or two in that time period.
Google in relation to your military experience, or
No, I went to school with a guy that was working there under this other company. It's a contract company that did what's called trust and safety. So these are the people that go through trust and safety at a tech company, are the people who go through the content on the tech company's platforms to find things that like violate terms of service, or like violent content, criminal content, stuff like that. And I worked with that company. It's called Vaco in Austin, Texas. I worked with them for about a year, where I that's what I did for my for that job. I basically combed through all of Google's platforms looking for like at the time would have been like criminal activity, any kind of criminal activity being talked about on the platform, violations in terms of service, misuse of like Google platforms for things like scams, phishing scams, stuff like that. And then like disinformation. At the time, they had an elections team that I did sent reports to for things like misinformation around elections. Specifically, one incident was like a local election where someone had made a fake Gmail account of a candidate to send out uh, basically derogatory campaign ads against that candidate using a Gmail address that was made to look like it was his official email.
so how does one go from doing that work into the water security?
Well, that was a big part about working for Mike was I had not most of my focus, especially in academia, was international focus. So when I was at the Bush School, I got what's called a Master of International Affairs, and my concentrations were grand strategy, international politics, and then the Middle East. And when I got hired by Mike, I've had not really had any experience with domestic topics, so I had to jump full force into it. I had to learn over the last couple of years. I've learned more about water security, energy, domestic politics, and and how the U.S. government works than I ever have in my entire life in the last 3 years. And water security was the first thing I worked on for Mike, and it's something I paid attention to. So I've learned a lot more about the dynamics, especially here in the U.S. when it comes to water security problems, because it's a big part of it is the western states and the Colorado River Basin, but there's Ogallala Aquifer in the Midwest is also a major water security issue for the U.S. I think, especially in long term, and it's been an ongoing fight. So it's been something I've been able to pay attention to for years because the western states have really been fighting over this water sharing issue, because they're coming up for renewal on that agreement next year, which
So
I think is a 5-year agreement.
okay, so I live in Arizona. I don't know if I told you that before we start recording, but I live in Phoenix, so I'm in the epicenter of all this. Is it fair to say?
Yes.
I personally think, let's start here. I personally believe at some point the Hoover Dam or Lake Mead is going to hit Deadpool status. And I don't think we're that far off from it. I don't know. I don't know when. I don't think it's today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. But I think it's going to happen in my lifetime, being that I'm 47 years old. What are your thoughts? Let's start with that and then drill down.
Well, we've been really Lake Mead and Lake Powell have been very close to Deadpool multiple times since 2022. I think the latest was late last year. Actually, there were warnings coming that they're close to Deadpool level, which just means that the water cuts off at Lake Mead or Lake Powell, and it can no longer flow over the dam. And I want to say at least 3 times. So on average, once a year over the last 3 years, it's been close to that. And I think that's actually played into these negotiations going on. So I've been paying as close attention as I can because there's kind of a tight lid, it seems like, on the lower basin and upper basin states in these negotiations. But some things have kind of leaked out here and there. And I think that the in what seems to be an increase in getting close to that Deadpool status has played a major role in how these states are handling negotiations, and I think how they're going to handle water sharing going forward long term.
What does that mean? If it so you're saying it's already touched? It's kind of in and out of Deadpool status, both at Lake Powell and Lake Mead.
No, it's not gotten to it. It's gotten very close, and it seems like at least out of one of those 3 times, it's gotten the closest it's ever been to Deadpool status, but not quite there. But there have been people warning, state officials warning at least 3 times in the last year. And I think scientists that have been paying attention, like water experts paying attention to it, that have been saying that have said warned at least 3 times over the last 3 years that they have gotten close to it.
What happens if it hits that?
Well, if it hits Deadpool status, all the flow to the states below that is cut off. So you're talking not only losing access to drinking water, but you're also going to see a major agricultural impact. A lot of the lower basin states are heavy on agricultural use for that water.
And if that occur, it's not even a question of if, it's when, right? I mean, it's unless God decides to bring large amounts of rain, which you never know what God what we can't underestimate the power of God, but I don't see that happening.
Well, I think that's so. Looking at what has happened since this current Trump administration on these, Doug Burgum, the Interior Secretary, he was considered uh, basically he was expected to come in and get these water negotiations going because they've been kind of held up over the last few years. They're supposed to renegotiate this deal by the beginning of next year, and he set a deadline actually to get some kind of movement done by this November before the federal government was going to step in. And from what I can see, they are trying to figure out how they're going to change the formula basically for how they release water from these reservoirs to the lower basin states. With the idea that it is just going to be an ongoing problem where every year there's going to be a little bit less water to go around. In the last I looked, there were kind of two paths forward. So the some of the states wanted to push basically releasing based on a rolling average of water flow rather than the reservoir levels. And then the lower basin states actually want the upper basin states to kind of feel some of the pain of water shortages by when they do start to get closer to dead pool level in Lake Powell, Lake Mead, then the northern states, the upper basin states basically have to take a hit there too and start rationing more water. So I think looking at that, these states are considering a much longer term issue here, having to deal with just less water every year.
What's the power struggle then between these states? And what states are involved in this?
So the primary states are Colorado, California, Utah, or Nevada, Arizona, and I think New Mexico also plays a role here. So the dynamic here, the power dynamic, is basically between the upper basin states where the water originates and the lower basin states that are reliant on that flow downriver. And
And the upper, sorry, not to interrupt you, but the upper basin states are Colorado.
off the top of my head, Colorado is one. I think maybe Utah, and some of the other states around Colorado. It's primarily is Colorado, but there are some other states around it. I think there's only really 5 states right now involved in these negotiations. So the lower basin states are California, Arizona, and Nevada. Because the power dynamic here is the upper basin and the lower basin. So the upper basin generates the water, or the water originates in the upper basin and flows down to the lower basin states. So when there is a water shortage and they have to cut flow, the lower basin states effectively take the hit. They have to start rationing water, and they don't like that. And right now there seems to be some pushback from the lower basin states to try to get that water rationing to go around basically, so they're not cut off while the upper basin states don't have to worry about water security.
So the federal government is trying to mediate this and come up with some type of deal to where the lower basin receives its fair share.
Well, from my understanding, the threat from Doug Burgum and the Interior Department is if the states can't get to an agreement, the federal government is just going to step in and basically get a blanket deal where everyone effectively gets a fair share of the water, but it's going to be a major cut compared to what they could get through agreement between themselves as far as how much water it goes around.
I mean, Robert, is it me or I mean, why would anybody live here knowing this?
Well, I don't know. Well, one of the big things also that I think plays into this is there has been an influx of people into some of these lower basin states like Nevada, as far as like residents. And then there was this big push for early on in the Trump administration for these freedom cities. Basically, they said, well, in the desert, federal lands in the deserts, we can put up these big cities that are going to have a lot of industry, a lot of commercial property and residents. One of the big issues with that I saw as soon as I heard that was, where is the water going to come from? Because you're talking millions of more people in these areas that are already struggling with water security in the long term. And I don't know where they're going to get the water from for that, honestly.
They they continue to build here in Phoenix.
Yeah, the amount of development was going around being discussed, and it wasn't even just the freedom cities. There was also this big push by Senator Mike Lee ahead of the big beautiful bill to get some public land sales in for housing. So the Trump administration had this idea, or at least Mike Lee and Doug Burgum had this idea that they were going to take federal lands out west that were unoccupied, open them up to sale for residential properties, basically. And I think, luckily for the water security situation, that seemed to have died off, because that, I think, if they were to build X million amount of homes on that newly allotted federal land, you're now going to have that many more people competing for what seems to be a diminishing amount of water to go around.
Do you think they understand the magnitude? And how big of a problem do you think this is?
I think in the long term, it's significant. The reason why I think it is actually a significant problem in the long term is what is being said around both the Colorado River Basin, and it's in the Southwest. It's not just the Colorado River Basin; it's also the 1944 Water Treaty with Mexico. So that also includes the Rio Grande River and I forget the name of the other river between Texas and Mexico. But the reason why I think it is significant is because the people talking about that issue are acting as if this is just a reality they're going to have to figure out. They're going to have to come up with a policy to deal with, rather than, like we've seen in energy, which is another topic I cover for Mike pretty extensively. Instead of or they're doing that instead of saying, well, there's this technology, or there's this fix we can provide to get more water. It just happens to come with a price tag of $100 billion grant or tax subsidy. They are just trying to find effective policy. In the Oglala Aquifer situation, it's actually, I don't think, mostly policymakers. It's actually farmers and ag scientists who are talking about that issue, where they're saying we're going to have to find ways to grow food with less water, and not necessarily selling some kind of policy or technology fix that just comes with a very nice $100 billion federal grant.
Well, also with this, I mean, okay, so all right, let me wrap my head around this a second. So you you got me blank here for a second, Robert. So okay, so the policymakers are saying something needs to change, but it's inevitable where this is going, right?
Yeah, and that so what they seem to be negotiating is how how to cut the amount of usage. So I think there was an agreement, or there was talk in this agreement, this negotiation, of having to cut the overall use of water from the Colorado River Basin, because it's just going to decrease every year. So they're trying to figure out some way to make that fair. Or there's a struggle between the lower and upper basin states to make that fair. But in general, just going to be less water to go around over the long term. And part of the problem is the replenishment of these groundwater sources and heavy overuse, especially agriculture. So, like in the Oglala Aquifer situation, a lot of that comes from a heavy use of that water for agriculture, especially cash crops, and just not allowing those natural groundwater sources to replenish at the level they should.
Now, is Colorado having the same issue? Because I mean, if they're the origin state, Upper Basin, they could easily cut off, or they could make it difficult for the lower basin states to receive water. But aren't they experiencing the same thing? Because it's extremely dry.
Yeah, but not to the same, obviously not to the same level as some of the lower basin states. That's why the lower basin states are pushing for that pain to be shared when it comes to water rationing. They're pushing for the northern states to have to cut back on water when the reservoirs do reach a certain level. Right now, as far as I understand, if the water reaches a certain cutoff level in the reservoirs, it's only the lower basin states that start to get rationing pushed on them.
And desalination, if I'm saying that correctly, I don't know if that's a viable option when you're talking about millions of people that are going to need these services.
Well, it's also very energy intensive. So when I was in college at UCF, I got to talk to a guy from the University of Florida. He actually worked on water purification projects in Gaza. There have been some desalination projects internationally. I think Israel has one. The Gulf states have looked at it, but it is very energy intensive and is costly. In the Gaza project he worked on, they actually used mangrove trees to try to help filter some of the water resources there, especially trying to get some of the trash and sewage out of it. And that seemed to be cost effective, but not as effective as other purification methods. It was just what they could work with. The other stuff is just very expensive, very energy intensive, and putting up desalination plants with the amount of energy they cost to actually desalinate a useful amount of water is, I think, going to add to energy problems that we're already facing. Not just from the rise of AI data centers and all these AI data centers and different data centers popping up, and industry trying to come back, but we're also facing down. I think the last December outlook from the Energy Information Agency, or the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, was that we're set to lose, I think, 100 gigawatts of baseload power generation in the next 2 years. And baseload power generation is your things like coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydrogen, things that are basically they can be dispatched. So you have this amount of power generation like a nuclear plant. If the nearby city that is utilizing the nuclear plant doesn't need to use all the power being generated, it can be sent down the grid to somewhere else that doesn't need it. Other type like the renewables like water and wind and solar can't do that. They're not dispatchable. They're only really generating power when the sun's out or the wind is blowing, and those projects have been heavily subsidized. So there's a lot of them being built in various stages of construction. At the same time, we're taking coal power plants offline, or they were supposed to uh, during the Biden era. And there was a push actually to get some of those same regulations that would have forced coal power plants out of business onto natural gas power plants as well. So we're talking 100 to 200 gigawatts of power generation we're going to lose. That would be worsened even more by adding a lot of desalination plants.
And to add a desalination plant, I mean, based on this conversation you had with this gentleman, I mean, he's talking about an area like Gaza where there's 2 million people. You're talking about, let's say, for example, Arizona, where I live. I mean, there's 6 million just in the valley right here. And where are you going to pull the water from?
Yeah, that's the other issue is the actual availability of water resources. So you're talking limited resources depending on the state, especially if you're talking like a landlocked state that is going to experience potential water shortages as a hypothetical. You can't where are you going to desalinate? There's already presumably groundwater resources, but they're not being replenished. So it's a resource access issue, but I think the costs of it, at least for now, are probably being looked at as not worth it, just because of the money cost, the investment cost, but also the amount of energy it has to use just to provide some amount of water.
And I'm just giving you one state. I mean, you got Nevada, you got New Mexico's part of that then too.
Yeah, I think the lower basin state. I think the lower basin states are, off the top of my head. I know Arizona and California definitely are. I believe Nevada is as well, and I want to say New Mexico is also involved in these water negotiations.
I read with if Lake Mead hits Deadpool status, that would impact Arizona, Nevada, California, and the country of Mexico.
Yeah, Mexico is so. There's this water sharing agreement we've had with Mexico since 1944. That they do get some water from the Colorado River Basin, but a lot of their water sharing with the U.S. comes from the Rio Grande and another river that they share with Texas. They're having their own water security issues. So they're behind when the last I looked it up, 1.5 billion cubic meters of water that they need to provide through this treaty. So basically, the treaty renews every 5 years. They're required to provide a baseload amount of water on average over the course of those 5 years every year. Mexico got behind during the second half of the first Trump administration, and they had, I want to say it was 2023, late 2023, Mexico City's main water source was actually being depleted faster than it could be replenished, and they were warning about having drinking water shortages in Mexico City. So Mexico is not going to be able to catch up on that water sharing agreement with the U.S., the 1944 water treaty, because they're having their own issues with water flow downriver, where they're not getting enough water to go around, not just for drinking water, but also for their own agricultural industry. So that's another, I think, point where that we're going to run into is this water sharing agreement between the United States and Mexico that is going to have to be renegotiated, or uh, a solution found to get. Or I think it's gonna. I think this is gonna be a point of conflict between the Trump administration actually and the Mexican government. Is the Trump administration has been pushing Mexico to try to catch up to that 1.5 billion cubic feet of water that they are behind on giving to the U.S. And they just don't have it. I think Claudia Scheinbaum has even said that outright. They do not have the water to do that, and that's going to become another conflict in the long run that could have international implications, geopolitical implications, because now you're talking about the U.S. in a foreign country having a conflict over water availability.
This is like a Mad Max movie, man.
Yeah, and when I say that, I don't think it's like 1 year, or like you said, it's not 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year, but it is a long term ongoing issue. So 10 years, 20 years, where we could start seeing some type of conflict, not necessarily open armed conflict, but diplomatic conflict, political conflict over water resources, especially in the western U.S. and Mexico.
I envision some type of mass exodus from these states at some point.
Well, yeah, I think eventually there will be people will go looking for to live where there's water availability. So you could see some type of pop. We've already seen this sort of sorting based on politics. I think we could start to see sorting based on resource availability, where people are moving states just based on the cost. Like if you're living in Nevada and suddenly your cost of having water access at your house doubles, triples, or quadruples, I imagine people are going to start looking at relocating to places where water is much more available.
Who's in worse shape then? Mexico or some of these lower? I mean, the lower basin states are in worse shape than the upper basin states.
I think Mexico's in worse shape than any of the U.S. states, and part of that is one of the ongoing issues with water with Mexico is that they have a lot of very heavily polluted waterways, and that's actually over the last year made its way up into the U.S. I think in California, there have been reports from like local governments saying that a lot that the sewage and trash problem that has polluted Mexico's waterways is actually getting so bad it's making its way up to the United States through the water flow out to the ocean. And I think they're going to be dealing with a twofold problem: one, lower water availability, and two, the water sources that they would be able to leverage are just heavily polluted.
How did it get to the point where they've gotten so polluted?
I don't know specifically on the ground there, but it just has to do with in these cities around waterways that don't have any kind of control over what is sent into that water. So one of the going back to the Gaza thing, one of the things in Israel that's interesting about their water situation is that one of their major waterways that goes through Tel Aviv actually goes around a trash dump that's just open air, and it just stuff can just roll into it. So that's another thing that probably is impacting Mexico. Is they probably have something like trash dumps or areas where people in the city dump their trash that happens to be nearby these water sources, or they even dump them directly into the water.
Yeah, what was the? They've talked about that in California. I don't know if they do it here, but was it using recycled water?
Yeah, using sewage water, recycled water. I personally don't know if I would want to subject myself to that, but that is one. one potential way forward that you might start to see some of these places with water resource issues is looking for other ways to get that water back. And there have been, I do remember reading about there have been overseas experiments with doing this, like trying to do this at scale, like reclaimed water through like sewage systems. I don't know how viable that is as a long term fix.
Based on the research you've done with water security in the Southwest, and I want to talk about the Midwest too. But would you move to one of these states right now, knowing what you know?
No, because I wouldn't do that if I was planning on staying there long term. You're talking like, having stay, like basically moving there permanently. I probably wouldn't do that.
How many years do you think somebody has left if they're listening to this?
I would say I think the Western states and especially Mexico are going to see increasing pain on this over the next 10 years. I would say somewhere between the 10 and 20-year mark, we might start to see more water availability issues. So we will see like the reservoirs like Lake Mead, Lake Powell getting close to dead pool more often. I think when we're talking like the 10 to 20-year scale. And that's what I would look at, especially if I was planning on moving to Arizona or Nevada or California, is the 10 to 20-year scale. If I was only going to be there temporarily, that would be a different calculation for me, a different calculus. And I think this is also going to play into some of the politics at the local level too. So California, a lot of the cities use, like people talk about the agriculture in California being very water intensive, but the cities also use a lot of water. And there has been, as far as I understand, some conflict between the Northern California agricultural areas in the Southern California cities. And I think we could even start to see the political fight over who has greater access to water resources at the state and local level, where cities are going to be fighting for access to water for sewage and drinking water, versus some of the more rural areas where you'll see people fighting for access to water for agriculture. And it's going to come down a lot to local politics.
Is Northern California in the same predicament as Southern California? Because they get a lot of rain, no?
Yeah, they have, well, one of the problems they have specifically been dealing with is they've been hit with this like drought and heavy rain and snow melt like cycle. So they'll have a drought issue where they have water shortages for their agriculture. And then the next season or in the middle of the season, suddenly they'll be hit by a huge snow melt or a huge amount of rain. So then they're getting flooded out. So they're kind of getting the worst of both extra water and less water.
Yeah, people don't realize that when the ground is hardened because of the lack of rain. When it does rain heavy, the flooding gets so bad. I mean, we had a storm about 3 weeks ago, and it was not one of the worst, but it was up there. It's something I hadn't seen in a few years. The amount of flooding in the desert.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that played into that Texas flood last month or the month before, the big one that killed over 100 people. Was that area, if as far as I recall, had been in drought conditions that made the ground hard. So when the heavy rains did hit, the water is not absorbed, so now it has to go somewhere. So you get hit by a drought conditions, and the ground is not able to absorb all of this excess water now that you're suddenly blessed with. And in the situation like California and Texas, that leads to floods that kill people, unfortunately, and do damage to the crops that you're trying to grow with less water. So it's you would think it would seem to be intuitive that having these huge snow melts and huge rainfalls would relieve drought conditions, but in some ways it can be worse in the short term.
What are your thoughts on the state of Texas,
In general,
or just as it applies to water?
as there have been, I think some of the local governments have been trying to do something about water security. One of the problems that Texas, I think, is going to run into is they are building these AI data centers. So AI data centers aren't only energy intensive; they're very water intensive. They need that to cool their data center, to cool all of these computers that they're using. And that is, I think, going to exacerbate some of the water issues in Texas specifically, because now they're having to use up a lot of water just to have these data centers function. I think that the semiconductor industry is going to run into a similar problem. So, like in Arizona, there's the TSMC plant. They're trying to build more. That's a very water intensive industry. So that is going to, I think, contribute to in the long run to water security problems in the West.
Makes no sense to me. There's data centers. I don't know how many are here now, but my understanding is there's quite a few. Why would you put them here?
Yeah, that was the a question Mike actually asked me when I first started reporting on that was why are they putting them there? Well, it's I think for the most part it's tax incentives. The state level governments they want these industries to come in because they provide jobs, they provide economic GDP growth, they economic activity. But the major downside is that it's going to cause problems in other areas because unlike some other states in the east where they're dealing with just the power issues, now in the west where they're trying to incentivize all this industry, especially semiconductors and AI data centers, now they're going to contribute to that water problem.
Well, and a lot of these data centers too. How much are they even being utilized right now? Because they're building them
Uh,
everywhere.
so the there were warnings coming out starting about 2 years ago with these data centers saying, well, they're building all these data centers. It's going to cause a huge power shortage, rolling brownouts and blackouts. They potentially could, but the response to those warnings, it seems like, was actually some of these data centers have been put on pause. A big problem that they run into is actually getting onto the grid. So what they were doing, I think last year, some in the eastern states, they were looking for these retired power plants, like coal power plants, because they already had all of the infrastructure built to connect to the local grid, and they wanted to turn the power plants into data centers. And I think those ones have been more successful on average than like building up a whole new data center. So they're in various stages, sometimes put on hold just because they can't connect to the grid, or I imagine out west they're also going to be running into water issues eventually. So that would probably put a pause on some of these too.
Yeah, and even what you've just explained, in relation to water. But the other thing is, I mean, as you know, the summer in the Southwest, it's just so punishing and relentless. And if there's any type of infrastructure takeout or power outage, it's a death zone. One of my listeners sent to me, death zone or kill zone, which I agree with.
Yeah, I one of the so on the power issue, I think one thing that is not being discussed is there's been during the Biden era, there was this big push for renewables. So they're getting all these tax incentives, all these grants to build solar and wind. And on paper, that would add a lot of power capacity. But one of the things that earlier this year in Spain and Portugal, there was that huge blackout, the entire countrywide blackout. I remember reading there was a guy who provided a very interesting explanation for how that happened. I think he was from Germany. Is that when you get to like renewable sources like water or wind, I keep saying water, wind and solar, they just directly feed energy into the grid versus something like coal or nuclear that has a turbine that can basically keep the amount of power balanced on the grid, where it can absorb excess power when it's not needed and produce excess power when there's excess demand. In the Spain example, I think they had just crossed 50% renewables in Spain and Portugal on their grid, and then suddenly a windy night happens on a power line that needs maintenance and it causes a catastrophic failure because now you don't have enough dispatchable energy to absorb that excess power that is no longer being demanded because some part of the grid went down, and it just causes a cascading failure along the whole thing. I think in the US, there was this big push for the same thing. Basically, they want us to get to a certain level of renewable energy. And I think that is setting up another here in the US potentially in the future, another situation like that where you have let's say on PJM interconnection, they're the regional transmission organization for the grid that runs through Maryland, Pennsylvania, out to Ohio and like the very eastern part of Illinois and down into some parts of North Carolina. There's been a big push to get renewables there. And let's say they get over 50% of wind and solar. Well, if there's some major power line that connects some parts of the grid that goes down, and all of a sudden you have this excess amount of power on the grid that's not being demanded by all the homes and the industry that's now in a blackout. That excess power has nowhere to go, and now it starts causing this imbalance on the grid and this cascading failure. I think that's a potential scenario we're looking at too, if there continues to be this push to get a higher proportion of the grid onto renewables.
Talk to me about the challenge then on the Midwest front with the aquifers.
So the Oglala Aquifer, I think I first saw talk about this in 2023, and this was actually out of a newsletter, an agriculture focused newsletter, I think AgWeb, and they were covering a conference there that was filled with farmers and ag economists and agricultural specialists and academics, and they were trying to figure out what they're going to do about the Oglala Aquifer running out of water. They're talking long term too, like 10 plus years. And the problem there is that what these agricultural specialists and farmers all say is that it's not being replenished fast enough, and it's being very heavily overused in agriculture. So they're trying to find, or they were trying to find, agricultural practices that would be less water intensive, because that's the solution in their view, is that there's no secret technology or special policy that is going to make somebody money that can fix it. They're going to have to deal with it going forward and find ways to use less of it.
So, what states is that impacting?
I want to say you're talking like the Dakotas, Montana, and up in the northern Midwest and in the northern West.
Yeah, I was because Washington gets a lot of rain, right? Washington, Oregon. I would think they would be okay.
Yeah, they're for the most part they are in the Northwest, or Pacific Northwest. They're fine on water, I think. They there was this Biden administration proposal actually during the I want to say 2022, or I'm sorry, 2023, maybe early 2024. There was actually talk about blowing up some of the some dams in the Pacific Northwest to allow more water flow. But those dams also provide power, so now you're talking about a balancing up there. Their problem is going to be balancing water flow southward with power demands in the Pacific Northwest. It was a very crazy. I think it's the Seven Snakes River dams, a couple that the Biden administration was actually talking about just demolishing, that provide some amount of hydropower in that area, which was a very crazy story to come out. I don't think they ever made a move on that before the election, but that was a serious proposal from the Biden administration.
Why don't they just build a big water slide from Tennessee, and you channel it, have stops in Nevada, Arizona, California.
Well, that goes back to just a bigger problem with transportation in the U.S. We have the Rocky Mountain Range, and this mountain range that basically cuts off most of the eastern part of the country from the west, and moving water across that is going to be very logistically challenging.
What do you think the future of the Southwest is?
Well, I think over the long run, there will probably be fewer people as water resources deplete. And there, I think it's going to be much harder going forward on, for example, this water sharing compact between the Western states. So the next time they are supposed to have an agreement done is early next year. And then that cycle starts over again. So they have to have one by 2030, 2031. I think as they go forward with this, there's going to be the fight over who is going to get whatever share of that water is going to become more intense, because there's going to be less of it to go around. And you could see, like you said, some type of sorting of populations, where some people have sorted in the United States, moved away from high crime areas or moved away from high tax areas to low crime, low tax areas. I think we could see something similar happen with the availability of water resources, where people are moving from areas where water is less available to where it is more available and cheaper.
Well, and I envision a scenario where, like, even just in my neighborhood, because there's so much building going on right now that people are not going to be able to just sell and leave, because who's going to buy it?
Yeah, that's probably going to be lagging behind behind that trend. If we start to see people leaving because of water availability, there'll still be people building out in the West probably in the 2030s or the 2040s, while people are in the middle of leaving, and it's going to lag. I think there's going to be new houses up for sale in 2042 probably, when people are starting to leave Arizona and Nevada.
I mean, could you see a city like Phoenix? I think it's 6 million, population of 6 million now. I mean, could you? I could envision it cutting in half, if not less.
Well, I mean, we saw something similar with after the beginning of the deindustrialization of the U.S. Like Detroit was considered a major inner city internationally, and the population declined significantly because the industry left. And if you can make that analogous to water as a basic resource and a need. As water starts to deplete, you could see something that happened to some of these major cities out west that happened to Detroit, where you have a mass exodus.
See the same thing happening in Vegas then.
Um, I think most of that, it could. I think right now they're kind of limping along on their legacy, but I think the problem they're facing most immediately is that the tourism industry, and a lot, from what I understand, listening to people that live there and know about Vegas, the problem they're running into is that most people just don't want to go. Most people just don't want to go to Vegas anymore, especially younger people, and it's lost a lot of its luster. And that could actually start some of this exodus before the water problem really hits.
Yeah, that's like almost it's a triple whammy in Las Vegas. You have the tourism, the water, and then they can same thing. They continue to build these data centers as well. I'm assuming like they're doing everywhere else.
Yeah, a large part of the data centers being built right now, from what I understand, are centered in Virginia. That's been one of the big problems for like the PJM interconnection grid. They've been warning about having to build new power generation, having to, like, the wholesale prices have spiked a couple of times. They do these big auctions for basically companies put in bids to provide reserve power, basically. So if there is an emergency, they have dispatchable power they can send off to somewhere else that needs it, and they charge a price for it. Well, I think we reported on it in December 2023. There was a huge spike in the prices that were being charged, and they've had to basically redo that power auction. I think earlier last year, and even later last year, and so a big amount of that concentration of data centers, I think, is really in like Western or in Virginia in the East, and then out West you're talking Texas, Arizona, at least places that are not only going to be dealing with power, but like we said previously, going to now they're very water intensive. So it's really doing, I think, in the long run, hitting these Western states twice, because now you're going to have more expensive power and more expensive water.
This is the kind of stuff that you're just not hearing about out there right now. Like it's and people have said to me, they're like, "Why would you ever leave here?" And my response is, you just confirmed it. Why would you stay?
Yeah, it was actually something when we first started talking about the power shortage. We got a lot of pushback, especially from like Silicon Valley tech guys. I remember Mike said that when we published on Twitter, I think, one of our videos about the power shortage issue in early 2024, and there were some Silicon Valley tech guys who pushed back, saying that, well, no, this is never going to happen. Why are, like, this is all wrong. But as far as I can tell, over the last year, basically every state level official, now the Trump administration and federal officials, are recognizing that this is a problem and trying to stop it. Right now trying to stop it using like the Federal Power Act, by keeping some of these power plants online through basically federal orders. But in the long run, I think trying to reverse it. I think the power and water situation, how bad the impact is going to be, is going to depend on how successful the Trump administration can be in trying to get out west, trying to get some kind of water sharing agreement going. So if these states can't get their act together by November, I think that's when the Interior Department's going to step in. On the power front, it's about replacing that expected lost power generation that from these coal, especially coal power plants retiring.
Yeah, the water situation, though, to me, if you only have so much to work with, I mean, you have a power struggle and you're getting less and less every year, every deal. How do you even negotiate it? Because there's not enough to go around.
Yeah, that's going to be, I think, a problem with. I think we could see the federal government actually step in more in the future. So I don't think the Biden administration is really threatening to step in on this agreement. I mean, they so from
Trump, you mean
2020,
Trump? You mean Trump? Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, the previous
Oh,
administration, yeah. So I don't think they were really threatening to do this because well, there was a lot more time. They were from 2021 to January 2025. And it almost seemed like almost immediately, as soon as the Trump administration came in, they were like, "You need to get this done, even if we are going to make the decision on how this water is shared, and everybody's going to have to use less." And that might even happen more in the future, where let's say in the next cycle of water negotiations from 2026 to 2031, the federal government might actually step in that time period, or they might have to. They might be forced to because of the disagreements between these states, and say, "Well, not only are you going to not only are we going to force this agreement on you, but everyone is going to cut the amount of water they're using." Because that's from what I understand, that's the actual threat from the Trump administration is they're going to step in and tell everyone they have to cut even more water. And if you don't want to cut even more water, then you need to. They're telling these states they need to figure it out.
yeah. That's my cue that I need to get out of here, Robert. I mean, it's to leave this area because I don't think there's I don't think there's a solution for it.
Yeah, unfortunately, right now it's the only thing the one thing that I think is indicative of how it's going to go is the Ogallala Aquifer, where all of these people who actually use the water from there and all the people in the area, the agricultural specialists, economists, researchers, and farmers are all saying we just have to use less water. That's probably the way forward.
So you're working on that. What else is priority for you right now?
One of the big things we've been covering for the last month has been these federal government surges of federal agents and National Guard into Washington, D.C., the impending one in Chicago, and now the Trump administration is talking about going into a lot of other cities. Baltimore, they floated, Portland, Oregon, going back to L.A., I think even San Francisco, San Diego. And we've really been diving as deep as we can into what the Trump administration is actually doing here. So there's one track here where, and this is based on what Trump himself is saying, is that this is about lowering crime. They're sending National Guard and federal agents in Washington D.C. to get the crime lower because that's his obligation as the president. There's also, I think, a political angle here where the Trump administration is trying to show inhabitants of major cities that crime is a choice basically from their local government, and that if the resources are dedicated to actually enforcing crime, it can be done, which I think goes further towards the midterm elections. I think the Trump administration is trying to basically make the case for the midterms for the Republican Party that they can just do things, and one of the big issues is crime.
Yeah, the Chicago aspect of it. I mean, it's been going along now, but nothing so far has been. They haven't moved forward with it. And I know it's I've had other people on and we've talked about this where you're talking about D.C. It's a federalized. It's not a city, right? It's a federalized district. I think, like if I'm wording it correctly. I mean,
Yeah, and they only have really a city government because of the Home Rule Act.
so when you start talking about Chicago, and then you're also going to have opposition from the governor to the mayor that are going to do everything they can to make sure that it doesn't succeed. What would and I'm thinking like worst case scenario here. What would happen if, let's say, the drug trafficking, the drug flow is slowed down? These people are not going to go away quietly, and if you start having kinetic attacks with guards, National Guard people, soldiers, where does this thing go? All of a sudden, now Trump inherits the problem.
Yeah, that's a risk for Chicago. I don't think it may be a higher risk than some other places, but I actually think that there's not going to be a confrontation between especially criminal organizations, domestic criminal organizations, at least in the Trump administration in Chicago. I know there's been a couple of social media videos going around of people claiming that they're gang members that they're going to fight back. If we look at the Washington D.C. example, they went away. They just went quiet, basically. Like they didn't go away necessarily, but they slowed down. And that, I mean, that's I think that's more likely than, fortunately, than some kind of fight between the National Guard and the Latin Kings in the middle of Chicago, which could end up becoming a major political quagmire for the Trump administration.
And then what's the end game with it as well? Like how long do they stay? When do they leave?
Well, I think the idea was 30 days, but in Washington, D.C., they just renewed the Washington, D.C. National Guard orders for another 30 days. And some of these other states, their National Guard are there at least through December right now. The some of the blue states, especially, I think are going to be much shorter because the Trump administration has also floated going to New Orleans, which Louisiana is a red state. I think part of that was because they'll get more support at the state level than they would in California or Illinois or New York or Maryland. Um, so if it actually does happen in New Orleans, that might be longer term just because they have more state support. If they do surge into Chicago or go into Baltimore, I think that's going to be much shorter term just because the lower amount of support they're going to get from the state level.
Well, and then you could look at every major city, right? The top 50 or top 75 cities, and they're all having. I mean, all the problems are on the rise for throughout all of them. I would have to think.
Yeah, and that was actually a point that the California Governor Gavin Newsom his media team started making about there are these high crime cities in red states. Why isn't the Trump administration or Republicans doing anything about that? I think that actually gave Trump the idea of going to New Orleans potentially. Like that was, I think somebody in the Trump administration said that's a good point, and we should start looking at some of these high crime cities that are effectively in some state of civil unrest just from crime, and saying, well, why don't we do this? That's I think why they floated the New Orleans idea.
I mean, just yesterday in Cleveland, where I'm from, after the Browns game, they had a shooting downtown. 5 people, I think, got shot.
Yeah, and a large I think a large part of it where you so the Newsom's point was like, well, why are you going into these blue states? Is obviously for local reasons. You have all these cities in these red states. Well, I think part of that is that in these cities, a lot of it is they're run by political machines, and for multiple reasons. I think one big one being that these major metro political machines are run usually by the Democratic Party. Some part of their constituency falls the people who commit the most crimes. You're talking people like 3, 4 arrests are in most of these cities are committing like more than 70% of all crime in the entire city. Some of those people do fall into the constituency of those political machines. There's also, I think, so there's a political patronage angle there where they don't want to arrest these people for those reasons. I think there's also in some of the more far left progressive circles when you're talking like Chesa Boudin, the district attorney out in California and LA that was recalled. I think it might have been San Francisco where he was recalled like 2 years ago. There's also an ideological angle there where some of these people who are much more ideologically far left are getting elected into some of these offices. They're taking over some of the political infrastructure of these machines and releasing criminals multiple times, violent criminals, for ideological reasons. So you're talking like historically, the analog would be the Soviet Revolution in Russia, where the Bolsheviks released prisoners from the state-run prisons to create what they would say create revolutionary conditions, basically disrupting the population. And I think that's the two major angles here of why you're seeing cities have this rampant violent crime problem across the board, basically. And it's not. I don't think it's very much. I don't think it's state dependent.
Well, also too with the National Guards. I mean, these are part-time people. They have full-time jobs.
Yeah, that's another problem with I think the Trump administration strategy on this. So they another thing they were talking about doing, they actually floated in 2020 was creating these national level quick reaction forces. So one would be stationed in Alabama, one would be stationed in Arizona. They'd be 300 personnel each at any given time, and all these different states would rotate their own guys in and out of it. But you're talking, I think it was 90 days. for 300 National Guard personnel to be on active duty orders once a year or once every other year is a lot of time to spend away from your job and home. And now they're talking. They also want to put up civil disturbance units at every state National Guard command. So now you're talking a contingent of probably effectively semi active duty personnel that are going to be called up. I think increasingly in the future, like if they do get this capability, they're going to want to use it, and you're going to run into, I think, a morale problem and a recruiting problem potentially for some National Guard units because of that. Because now it's not going to be as stable as the normal, 2 weeks a year, 1 week in a month.
What's a civil disturbance unit? I haven't heard that one.
So there was the executive order that was put out 2 weeks ago by President Trump, and in that he established a civil disturbance unit in the Washington D.C. National Guard that was actually going to be deputized by the DOJ. In that order, he also ordered the Department of Defense to stand up a similar civil disturbance unit in all 50 states, every National Guard command. I think the idea is having some resource on hand already in a state to act as like a quick reaction force for if we see like a repeat of the 2020 riots and major demonstrations. That would actually be there on the ground faster than this other project they're doing, this 600-man quick reaction force.
Yeah, when Mike was on last week, he had said that he felt like we're moving towards an authoritarian government, and I'll tell you, I mean, some of the things that I'm hearing about and discussing, I think it's inevitable where they're trying to take us.
Well, unfortunately, I think that is a real risk. And part of that is that the Trump administration is coming in. I think the people in the White House right now are looking back at 2020 and an attempted color revolution on the Trump administration, and they're saying, well, what can we do to prevent this? And part of that is going to be increasing the power of the White House, I think. And then I think Mike and I talked about this last week. There's the potential that there could be a much more ideologically motivated Democratic candidate in 2029, 2028, or 2032 who takes power and swings it all the way to the other direction and escalates. And then we get into the cycle of these two major parties who are undergoing sort of their own internal populist revolutions, escalating every time they get into office. And we eventually get to a point where one or the other is going to decide that they can't afford to not be in control again. And Mike and I discussed the scenario that maybe we see the right wing equivalent of that in 2028 if they do get a populist left wing candidate in the Democratic Party who even wins. Maybe there is a response there from the people in the White House right now, especially people involved with Project 2025, who say we can't afford this, and now we have a problem.
How do you feel about the state of this country based upon what you and I have just talked about and your work?
I am able to see a lot more of the problems, I think, than the average everyday person, just because of the what topics I cover and what I'm listening to every day. There's the possibility or the risk of like falling into this kind of doom circle, this doom cycle of like, well, this really bad thing is happening here, this other really bad thing is happening. It's all compounding. My personal opinion is I don't plan. I know I've seen like people talking about becoming expats, going overseas. I don't plan on doing that. I was born here in Florida. This is where I'm going to stay, and I'm just going to deal with these problems as best I can.
Do you see it becoming more authoritarian? I can never say that word. Surveillance, tightening the grip or tightening the noose, so to speak.
I think unfortunately we have a very high potential for that. Politics right now, really over the last couple of cycles, but right now is becoming much more. Uh, Both sides are basically playing for keeps and are now recognizing it. And so you have, I think, a sentiment on the left to do whatever they can to stop Trump, and a sentiment on the right to do whatever they can to take control of the machinery of government and prevent that cycle. With them obviously ending up in power. And I think we could end up in that cycle where it's going to go back and forth, and somebody is going to decide that it's time to stop it, and we're just not going to have elections.
Yeah, I had Martin Armstrong on here a couple of times, and I didn't get a chance to ask him last time we talked, but he had said in previous conversations that I think 28 would be the last election.
Yeah, Mike and I have talked about that a lot. Um, it could be, especially in that scenario where you have a major popular response to the Trump administration. Popular doesn't mean majority of the United States, but some plurality or some major proportion of the United States says we have to go the other direction, and they get a populist left wing candidate. That 2028 might be the last election, especially if they win. There is a risk that somebody like JD Vance or people around him, the Project 2025 people, do say we have to put a pause on this. Like, we can't afford, America can't afford it, and they're making that decision. And now the level of civil unrest, potential civil unrest, is greatly increased, and that has to come with some type of strengthening of the state. Basically, you're talking domestically, not necessarily like a bigger military, a bigger federal police force, some type of enforcement mechanism, greater surveillance. I mean, we already have a lot of surveillance, but it could be more intrusive.
Well, that's where coming back to the National Guard for a second, I just have a hard time believing it's about restoring law. And what concerns me, ironically, as we're approaching 9/11 this week, which is also my mother's birthday, which, Mom, if you listen, happy birthday. Um, my mom listens to all this stuff, so she'll appreciate that. But you the whole creating of Homeland Security and creating of TSA, and people were cheering this. And I'm seeing this now with the National Guard, and I'm almost wondering, like, all right, we having deja vu here, because people are like, and mind you, I'm all for crime getting cleaned up, but what I've said, this is a slippery slope. You go down this path and you start putting soldiers in all these cities. Where does it end? And, like, not only where does it end for how many cities, but where does it end with the exit strategy? And again, people are cheering for this. They want it. And I'm like, haven't we been down this road before?
Yeah, that is one of the problems, I think, especially if it is effective, because people will. I think generally there's this idea, and it's popular among political accelerationists, like the on the left, like the Cloud Piven strategy type people; on the right, the white nationalist accelerationists, that making conditions worse, making the government more oppressive, is going to cause some kind of mass uprising, mass mobilization. That just doesn't happen. People will most people, 80% plus of the population, are just going to adapt and deal with it. In this case, if the Trump surge is successful, they might even cheer it on, because they're in their personal lives they're going to experience less crime. There's more police, there's military on the streets, less room for, especially if they are actually fighting criminal groups, criminal organizations, and criminal activity. They could cheer it on because in their personal lives they're experiencing less crime. On the larger level, the political level, though, that is one avenue to get something like that to happen, is under the guise of enforcing crime. Now you're creating all of these new entities in new power bases and centers of gravity for exercising control.
Yeah, what did you call it? The disturbance unit? What's
Yeah,
that?
they're calling them like civil disturbance response units or something like that. Effectively, what they're doing in DC, I don't think they're actually going to be deputized by the DOJ in the states. In the DC example, they're supposed to be being deputized so they can actually make arrests.
Where can people find you, Robert? Where can they find your work?
Well, I'm on Forward Observer, forwardobserver.com. We do our daily sit rep every morning, and then our high side brief. You can also find me on LinkedIn under my name, Robert Cook, and some of my social media. My official Twitter account for Forward Observer, we call it FO Watch Floor, is our official account, where we post videos and interesting items that we find throughout the day that are newsworthy.
And then your personal X?
It is at Gator, Gator, Raid, Raid, actual, Actual.
Robert, thanks for doing this. I'd love to have you back on as these things develop, and I look forward to continuing to follow what you're doing, and we'll see where this all goes.
Yeah, I'd love to be on again. It was nice to meet you, and tell your mom I said happy birthday.
I will. Thank you so much. Mic drop.
Thank you.